This is self-video number 1 on Anderson's policy formulation, pages 114 to 132. So once a public problem is identified and receives significant and serious attention from government officials, the policy process moves into the next stage, which is policy formulation. Policy formulation involves developing pertinent and acceptable proposed courses of action for dealing with public problems. Essentially, it is what a government proposes to do about a certain problem. Policymakers may be confronted with several competing proposals for dealing with a problem, or they may have to struggle with coming up with their own alternative. However, they usually draw from a vast pool of policy proposal ideas from the past that have already been developed. Mimicry is a common form of policy formulation. Policy proposals are likely intended to make incremental changes in existing policy. It's very rare that there is a radically innovative policy that is proposed. It's also important to remember that policy formulation does not always culminate in law, executive order, or administrative rule. In short, that a public problem reaches policy agenda and that it reaches the policy formulation stage does not mean positive action will be taken, or if it does, that it will be soon in coming. Awareness of a problem does not guarantee positive governmental action, although unawareness or lack of interest pretty much guarantees inaction. There are several factors that will affect the policy formulator's chance of producing a successful policy that they have to keep in mind. So these things include asking whether a policy is technically sound, directed at the problem's causes as far as they can be ascertained. They also ask what are the budgetary costs of the proposal to both the government, taxpayers, and private entities such as corporations. And are those costs reasonable and acceptable? They also ask, is the policy politically acceptable? Can it win bipartisan support if that's necessary, or can it win majority support? The addition or deletion of various provisions may be warranted in order to gain support here. Then, finally, they must ask, if the proposal becomes law, will it be acceptable to the public? Will they comply with it? So, there's several different branches of government and people involved in formulating public policy, including the president, agency officials, adhocracies, legislators, and their staff, and interest groups. The president, with his chief aides and advisors, has been the leading source of initiative in forming major policy proposals, which either originate in the agencies or have been floating around in Congress and Washington as problems for a while and are now picked up by the president because they fit in with his agenda and his policy proposals. The members of Congress have come to expect the president to present them with draft bills embodying their recommendations. Next, you have agency officials. Because of their specialization, expertise, and continued involvement in particular policy areas, they're really important in formulating policy because they can identify weaknesses, omissions, or loopholes in a certain bill or law and propose a different way to make sure that people can't exploit that law anymore. They also know a lot about it, so they can help with the technical details of drafting a bill. Temporary organizations, called adhocracies, are also important in the policy formulation process. They're established by the president to study particular policy areas and develop proposals. It's important to note that they don't always, though, give the answer that the president is looking for. Instead, they might come up with a conflicting policy, and these include presidential commissions, task forces, interagency committees, and can even also include a committee jointly composed of executive officials, members of Congress, and perhaps private citizens appointed by the president and legislative leaders to devise a solution to a problem. In the court, legislators and their staff are also involved in formulating policy. In the course of congressional hearings and investigations, through contacts with administrative officials and agency officials, as well as interest group representatives, and on the basis of their own interests and their goals for accomplishing certain things while they are in office, legislators receive suggestions for action on problems and formulate proposed courses of action. Much of the actual writing of legislation is handled by congressional staff members who have expertise in a particular policy area. They worry about the details, the choice of words or phrases, the inclusion of particular provisions, and whether, if enacted, it will do what its supporters want it to. Finally, you have interest groups, which play a major role in policy formation, often going to the legislator with specific proposals for legislation. They also work with executive and legislative officials to develop and enact a policy, perhaps with some modifications to suit their interests. Because they specialize in a particular area, they're really good at providing advice and specific technical details for bills, for policy proposals. Next, we look at policy formulation as a technical process. So policy formulation has two different sorts of activities. The first is to generally decide what, if anything at all, should be done about a problem. So the answers to these questions take the form of general principles or statements. Once such questions have been resolved and they've decided to take action on a certain problem, then the second type of activity comes into play. They must draft specific bills so that when adopted, these policies will appropriately carry the agreed upon principles or statements into effect. Often, new legislation must also be appropriately tied in with existing statutes already in the law. So, the way a bill is written and the specific provisions it includes can substantially affect its administration and the content of public policy. The writing of laws has to be done skillfully, because as soon as these laws or rules are put on the books and go into effect, people begin looking for loopholes or try to bend the meaning of the language to their advantage. Clarity in phrasing and intent may also help protect the laws and rules against unfavorable judicial interpretations and provide clear guidance to those assigned to the task of implementation. So, now that we know about the process of policy formulation, who is involved, and the technical details that we need to go into it, we can look at the case study and see how this applies. So, the Affordable Care Act is a health care bill, and it's recently gone into effect in around 2009. Before that, there was a lot of talk by other presidential administrations and action to implement certain healthcare reforms. So the problem has been identified, the problem has been around, and it's already been given significant attention by policy officials. So now with Obama, it can go right into the policy formulation stage. So using that case study, we can see that there's a number of different government officials and agencies involved in formulating that policy. So first, it was the president, aided by his advisors, who came up with general standards that he wanted accomplished in the bill. So then, 3 committees in the House took that on and came up with their individual bills and then melded them all into a single bill. So the president gave them a general idea of what to do, and then the 3 committees in the House, aided by their congressional staff, came up with the specific technical details of the bill. Then, in order to gain majority for support for the bill, certain provisions had to be changed. So that's all about the 4 questions that go into producing a successful policy. So some things needed to be changed, such as the amendment on abortion, to gain a majority vote in the House. So once that bill was approved in the House, it went to the Senate. And the Senate had two committees that worked on it and changed the bill in the technical way. And then once a majority was gained, they also had to accommodate individual legislators and their demands in order to gain that majority. Then the Senate approved the bill with a narrow majority, and it was voted, and the president approved it. So there were so many different people involved in the policy formulation, and each of them every time had to consider those questions as what would allow them to make this policy successful. So as demonstrated by the case study, policy formulation is a complex process involving many different levels and branches of government, as well as those external to the government interested in influencing policy and how that will affect